It's Poetry Pea's birthday. Can you believe that we're going into our 8th year? I was curious as to how the podcast had changed. I barely remember the early days, post-menopausal brain, and the recent bump to the head probably. Anyway, I thought I'd like to have a listen, so I went back to some early episodes. For some reason, and it's probably because it's so bad, I didn't keep the first one, but I did find the second ever episode of the podcast. Have a little listen.
If you were listening to episode 1, then you'll know that I have a couple of goals for the podcast. One is to develop a community that loves haiku in particular, but poetry in all forms. And the other is to write a haiku a day for a year, in the hope that it will help me personally to really start to enjoy the small things. Perhaps you've had the opportunity to go to poetrypea.com and have a read of my first week's effort, but not to worry if you haven't. I'm going to read them to you now. I have to say, I wasn't sure it was the right week to start my project. The day before I started, my cellar was flooded. And the day I started was the day the builders came to put a new kitchen in my house. And anyone who's been through that probably knows that that can be a very frustrating experience. Writing my daily haiku helped with all the stress that was going on around me. So without further ado, I give you week 1. Monday. Oh, the restful sound, water dropping on still pond. Not in my cellar. Tuesday. The patch of sunlight warms a single garden chair. Hush, cat is dozing. Wednesday. Mosquito dances whining past my sleepy ear. Vengeance come dawn. Thursday. Check out those mountains with their fancy new white coats. Arrogant beauties. Friday. Path of ancients, domed by nature's guardians. Confluence of shades.
So I was basically talking to myself, although by episode 4 I did have some friends, honest. It was interesting to hear that I had wanted to create a haiku community. But in my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined what happened. Thanks to all of you for becoming my haiku friends. It brings a birthday tear to my eye to think how far the Pea has come and how far our friendship reaches. Thank you. Now, I also said I was going to write a haiku a day. You might be pleased to know that I kept that up for at least the first year, and just as well that I did, because those first efforts were absolutely horrible, weren't they? I have got better. Now, I probably write fewer poems. Well, I definitely write fewer poems, but I edit them more thoroughly. And of course, I do have a much better idea of what I'm doing. Many thanks to all of you who from the very start have done your best to improve all that I do here at Poetry Pea, including the haiku I write. Giddy, if you're listening, special thanks to you, as you were from the very beginning, always thorough in your critique of my work. We all need a teacher who encourages us to aspire to write at the highest level. Then I went on to have a listen to the first episode of the second series. and that made me smile. Have a listen to a bit of it.
Now, before I set out to think about this podcast, I went for a little walk through the woods and up the hills near my house to the duck ponds. It's one of my favourite walks. We'd had a little bit of snow here in Zurich, and then some very cold days. The thermometer on my patio was reading around -6 centigrade during the day. It was very chilly indeed. Anyway, on the walk the snow was crunchy underfoot. The duck ponds were frozen over, and I was very thankful that I was, as they say around here, gut ausgerüstet. That is, I was well kitted out to keep out the cold. And it got me thinking, what makes us well equipped to be haiku writers? And it brought to mind something I've been thinking about whilst on the Christmas break. Haiku history and what was going on poetically as the haiku came into being. I dip in and out of the history of haiku from time to time, and this time my interest was piqued by an article by Alan Summers. Why haiku is different and Basho never wrote them in English. I recommend it as an interesting read. The link, of course, will be on the show notes. And speaking of whom, he had a very pleasing haiku featured in the Haiku Foundation's Per Diem on Boxing Day. Crowded train, a dozen yellows crackle. Crowded train, a dozen yellows crackle. It's very visual to me and takes me straight back to my time commuting by train in London. Happy days. But before I continue with a bit of history, I want to ask for a little bit of help. I wrote this haiku. Actually, I'm writing this haiku. At the moment, it's unedited. Let me read it to you and talk about it at the end of the podcast. The question I'd like you to mull over would be, does it work in this incarnation? Does it stimulate your mind to imagine what I'm possibly talking about, or is it just too ethereal? White sun. What a difference a hill makes. Orange sun. White sun. What a difference a hill makes. Orange sun. So, back to the history. There's a podcast on Shiki in season 1. It's episode 21. I talked a little bit about his development of the idea of sachet. In this episode, I'd like to think about the origin of haiku as we know it today, and the Western poetry scene at the time that Shiki was alive. It's generally acknowledged that there are 4 masters of haiku: Basho, Buson, Isa, and Shiki. But in reality, the first 3 poets didn't write haiku as we know it today. They would have been participating in the writing of linked verse. For example, Basho wrote this, which we're all familiar with in its various translations. This one's by Adam L. Kern. Old pond. A frog plunges into water sound. I don't know about you, but I always think of this in isolation as a haiku. But actually it was composed as a linked verse. And here I'll give you the response. On young leaves of rush hangs a spider's web. Old pond. A frog plunges into water sound. On young leaves of rush hangs a spider's web. Old pond. A frog plunges into water sound. On young leaves of rush hangs a spider's web.
I'm still doing the weather forecasts. I can't help myself. You can take the girl out of Britain, but you can't take Britain out of the girl, can you? Have you ever noticed how we Brits like to talk about the weather? It's somehow inbred in us. I'm still also learning about sachet. In episode 37 of this 7th series, I'm still talking about it, but this time I'm talking about it in terms of tanka. I think that means I'm staying true to one of the goals I had at the start, to deepen my knowledge and share what I'm learning with you. Now, that horrible haiku of mine in series 2, episode 1, let's hear it again.
White sun, what a difference a hill makes. Orange sun. White sun, what a difference a hill makes. Orange sun. Were you able to make sense of it? Not necessarily exactly what I meant, but did it mean something to you? Or does it need an explanation? If I tell you that I was driving along the bottom of the hill on which I live, it was very early in the morning and the mist was quite thick. The sun was doing its best to shine, but looked quite white through the fog. However, as I drove up the hill, I got above the cloud base, and there it was in all its glory, a beautiful orange sun. Happens a lot round here.
In one way, it was successful. It took me right back to the moment that I was describing. I could see the exact scene again. So it worked for me, but probably not for anyone else. I had a look through my notes to see if I ever worked on it and got it into any sort of shape that I liked, but I couldn't find it. I'd still like to know, though, if anyone has a good idea how to resurrect and save it. If you do, please email me. Thanks for joining me and reliving the past. I think maybe it will give hope to anyone just starting out on their haiku journey to know that if you keep at it and interact with others, you can write a fairly decent haiku from time to time. This is one of mine that made it to the shortlist of the Touchstone Awards at the Haiku Foundation. The river in every room, brown trout. The river in every room, brown trout. And that was originally in The Heron's Nest. You know what? As I put this podcast to bed, it's absolutely filthy weather here again. But inspired by my past self, I'm going to get my hiking jacket out, lace myself into my heavy weather hiking boots, and head off to see the ducks. I've not seen them for a little while. See you next week. Until then, keep writing. And don't forget to send me any ideas about that absolutely terrible poem, which I'll put in the show notes in case you want to read it. And I think there were some other little changes between the early podcast and this one. What do you think? Tell me. Ciao.